If you've ever met anyone who talks about their winch and says, I used it once, then a year later I went to use it again and it didn't work, then you've probably met someone who's never maintained their winch at all. Now this particular winch lives on the full drive action DVD vehicle, so it's copped to hiding every day of its life. In fact, in the last 6 months, this has pulled them through Tassie, the Cape and the Kimberley. Now it's back at the workshop. I've got a couple of hours, so I'm going to give it a quick freshen up before I bolt it back on, and it'll be ready for another 6 months of tough tracks and ready for any recovery. Now your winch will last you many, many years, so long as you look after it. Now the single biggest killer of any winch isn't using it in a tough recovery like a gnarly bog hole or dirty river crossing. It's actually letting it sit for months and months without being used. Now that's because any moisture in the winch will actually corrode your gearbox or electrical components. After every trip, or at least once a month, spend 5 minutes and unspool about 15 meters of winch rope under power, free spool for 5 meters, then power back in. If you've used your winch for a few tough recoveries, then you can take it one step further and actually service your winch. Now that's because the grease inside over time will absorb some moisture and lose its effectiveness. Now this is a really important step that means your winch will be pulling hard the next time you need to use it. So first thing you're going to need to do is pull your winch out and get it up onto a bench. That means you can sort of assess its overall condition and start pulling it apart. Now in order to service both your gearbox and motor, all you need is a few basic tools and then some degreaser, new grease and some sealant to put it all back together. The first thing you'll need to do is remove these 3 steel struts that combine the gearbox with the motor. That'll make it really easy to take those two halves apart. If your rope's in good condition, you can just take your whole drum and set it aside. So now I'm going to test the motor really quickly just to see how it spins up. For that I'm using a couple of jumper leads connected to a 12 volt battery, and I've made up a little short jumper lead which can bridge two of the terminals. You can use a normal length jumper lead as well. First things first, we'll grab our little jumper lead and connect it to the back terminal and either one of the front 2 terminals on the motor here. Next we'll grab our negative lead and that goes underneath to the ground terminal on the winch. Make sure that's nice and tight. Finally, grab your power lead and touch it to that last terminal. You'll see the motor spin up in that direction. So the bearing looks fine, the motor sounds fine, but we're just going to pull it apart anyway to check out the internal condition. We're going to need a socket to undo these 2 bolts. With one end cap off, we're just going to grab a little hammer or mallet and just tap that other end off. Should come off fairly easily. Right, so there's a tiny bit of corrosion in there. We'll get that out before we put it back together. Next we can pull the motor out of the housing and you'll see a bit of wear on this copper here. So you can get a bit of wet and dry sandpaper, really fine, and just sand that up. So we've pulled the rubber off from this side, tiny bit of corrosion, we clean that up really quickly, and now we just clean up that rubber seal again and we can put it back in. Right, so the shaft looks perfect. The housing looks good, we've cleaned up that seal. I'm just getting a bit of wet and dry sandpaper here on the inside of this housing. A little squirt of brake cleaner, just to get rid of any corrosion. It's good to go back together. Righto, so we've cleaned up that end cap. Make sure that little washer goes into the base there. Next, we'll put the motor back together. Just there, flick the whole thing over. If you've got a spare pair of hands, your mate's over, it makes this a lot easier, but otherwise you're just going to have to force these 4 bushes right back. Okay, so we're just going to put that seal back in nicely after we've been playing around with the motor. We'll check this bottom one in a second. That means we can put this end cap back on, taking care of that washer in the bottom there. All right. We'll check this other seals in nicely. Before we match up this little pin here, goes into this little hole here. You'll feel that just slot in. We can put these bolts back in. So the motor's back together. I've nipped these bolts up. We're just going to tighten them up now to make sure that those rubber seals are all well and truly waterproof. There's also a little rubber washer on the bolt there. So make sure it's nice and tight and well sealed. So we've got the gearbox here. The first thing we're going to need to do is undo these 8 Allen head bolts around here so we can pull that end off to get to the planetary gear sets. Get that last little bolt out there. This will have to be removed. If it is a bit tight, you can tap around the edges with your hammer. This one's nice and loose, thankfully. Just watch out because we've got a bunch of spring washers in all of those holes. Just going to put a glove on here to avoid most of that grease getting on my hands. It's just a matter of pulling out. Stop there. Righto, so we've got all our parts in the tub here. I'm also going to put this gearbox housing inside as well. That way we can degrease everything at the same time. Now it's important to degrease it and get rid of all that old grease, because old grease and new grease won't mix very well. They might have different viscosities. There might be grit or even a lot of moisture still trapped in that grease. Righto, so we've coated everything with degreaser. We've got a bit of methylated spirits in there as well just to soak everything. You can see all that old grease coming out. So we're going to leave this for a couple of hours, let it all really penetrate everything, come back with a clean rag, wipe it all down and re-grease it. Right, so your next step is just to get all that old grease out of these gear sets. As you can see, I've already done the first two here. Make sure they're really well wiped down. It should be quite easy if you've let them soak for a fairly long time. The next step after that is just to re-grease them with some fresh grease. So first of all, I'm going to grab a bit of grease and just line the outside of this gearbox housing here. Nice even coating, but not too much, otherwise it will be very hard to turn your free spool. We've then got to pack it into all those little planetary gears as well. Grab this little gear. This little gear here goes in the bottom. This small plastic base. Righto, so while you're putting it back together, you'll have these plastic bushings and you'll notice a small split ring on the base of this gear here. Now you make sure that beveled edge, I don't know if you can see it there hopefully, should fit down and over that ring to make sure it's flush with that surface. And then the whole thing will slide in as one unit. Hopefully you can see that into the bottom. Let's move on to the next one now. Is ready to go in. Put that plastic bushing, beveled edge down, bit more grease. We've got the last one here. So we've greased up this last planetary gear set. Just a nice even coating, not too much. I'm going to slot it down into here. I'm just cleaning up this gasket surface to make sure when we bolt it back together it mates correctly and gives us a nice seal. If your gasket has some tears in it or it's not looking too good, you can use a liquid gasket, but look for something that's good on alloy surfaces and doesn't set too thick. Righto, now we're going to line up these holes here with the drum housing and put it all back together. Just making sure they line up. Grab your bolt, washer on, a little bit of thread sealer. In it goes. So do that for all 8 bolts and nip them back up. Righto, so we've put those bolts back in there, nip them up tightly. Next thing to do is grab our drum. Just quickly wipe off any old grease you can get to. We'll slide that in there. And on this side, make sure you put this drive shaft in first to make things a lot easier. Locate it in there. So it might be a bit easier if you stand it up to make sure that this spline lines up easily. Now, very last step is to put these steel struts back together. Right, so everything's back together. Moment of truth, we're going to plug those jump leads back onto our battery, back onto the winch, just make sure everything's working correctly. Here we go. Negative onto the ground down the bottom. And the other way now. There you have it. Ready to go back in for another 6 months of adventures.